Welcome to the subconscious, where every story is a warm embrace for your mind. I believe the stories we listen to before we sleep shape the way we feel and think. That's why I've created a space for positive, uplifting tales. Stories filled with love, kindness, and success, with no sadness, no drama, just pure comfort. Let these real-life inspired stories ease your mind, bring you joy, and gently guide you into restful sleep. So, relax, close your eyes, and let the magic of storytelling take you to a peaceful place. Story 1. The Good Neighbor's Secret. When Emily Harper moved into her new home on Maplewood Lane, she never expected her life to change so profoundly. The quiet suburban neighborhood seemed perfect. A fresh start, a peaceful retreat from the hustle and bustle of city life. She had spent the last few years chasing deadlines and enduring long nights in her corporate job. Now, she longed for something simpler, something more meaningful. The first few days were spent unpacking and settling in, her golden retriever, Milo, trotting excitedly from room to room. She had chosen the house for its charm. The white picket fence, the sprawling oak tree in the front yard, and the little garden patch that had been left untended for some time. It felt like the perfect place to start anew. Emily soon noticed her next-door neighbor, Mr. Thompson, an elderly man with a kind smile and an air of quiet wisdom. He was always outside tending to his roses, humming an old tune as he worked. Something about him intrigued her. The way he moved with unhurried grace. The way his eyes held stories untold. One afternoon, as she struggled with a particularly heavy box, Mr. Thompson appeared at her doorstep. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice warm with sincerity. Emily smiled in relief. "That would be wonderful. Thank you." Together, they moved the box into the house. As they rested for a moment, Mr. Thompson glanced around and nodded approvingly. "This place has good bones," he said. "It's been waiting for someone like you to bring it back to life." Emily chuckled. "Well, I'm hoping to make it home." "You will," he assured her. "It just takes time." Over the next few weeks, their paths crossed often. Emily would see Mr. Thompson watering his plants in the early mornings, and he would always wave. Sometimes he would leave small gifts on her porch, a basket of fresh tomatoes from his garden, a loaf of homemade bread, a book with a handwritten note tucked inside the cover. She found herself looking forward to these small gestures, touched by his quiet kindness. One evening, as she sipped her tea on the porch, she noticed Mr. Thompson sitting alone on his own porch, staring at the sky. She hesitated before walking over. "Mind some company?" she asked. He smiled and gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Not at all." They sat in comfortable silence for a while before Emily spoke. "Have you lived here long?" "Oh, quite some time," he said. "This house has been my home for over 40 years." She raised an eyebrow. "That's incredible. You must have seen so many changes." Mr. Thompson nodded, a wistful look in his eyes. "Yes, but some things remain the same. Like the way a garden needs care to thrive. Like the way kindness, once given, always finds its way back." Emily smiled. "That's a lovely thought." As the stars twinkled above them, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. There was something about Mr. Thompson, about the way he carried himself, that made her feel at home. What she didn't know was that Mr. Thompson had a secret, one that would change her life forever. The next morning, Emily woke up to the sound of soft knocking on her door. Rubbing the sleep from her eyes, she opened it to find Mr. Thompson standing there, holding a small wooden box with intricate carvings. "I thought you might appreciate this," he said, handing it to her. Emily took the box, its weight surprising her. "What is it?" "Something that's been waiting for the right person," he said cryptically. "Open it when you're ready." She watched as he walked back to his house, curiosity blooming in her chest. Taking the box inside, she set it on the kitchen table and carefully lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of soft velvet, was an old key and a faded envelope with her name written in delicate script. Her heart pounded as she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was elegant, yet slightly shaky. "Dear Emily, if you're reading this, it means you were meant to find this box. There are stories hidden within these walls, waiting to be uncovered. The key belongs to a place that holds a part of your past, one you may not even know exists. With warmth and trust, Margaret Thompson." Emily's breath caught. Margaret Thompson. She glanced out the window at Mr. Thompson, who was calmly watering his garden as if he hadn't just upended her entire morning. Who was Margaret? And what did this key unlock? She hurried over to Mr. Thompson's house, the letter still clutched in her hand. "Mr. Thompson," she called as she approached. "Who is Margaret?" He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Come inside, Emily. It's time you knew the truth." Emily followed Mr. Thompson into his home, the scent of old books and lavender filling the air. His living room was cozy, lined with shelves brimming with books and framed photographs that hinted at a rich history. He motioned for her to sit as he settled into an armchair across from her. "Margaret was my wife," he began, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "She passed away many years ago, but she left behind something important, something I believe belongs to you." Emily clutched the key tightly. "But why me?" Mr. Thompson sighed, running a hand over his weathered face. "Because, Emily, your family." A stunned silence filled the room. Emily's mind raced. Family? How? He reached for a photo album on the table and flipped through the pages until he stopped at a black and white photo of a young woman holding a baby. Margaret had a sister, your grandmother. She never told anyone about you, but she knew, and she made sure this key would find you one day. Emily's hands trembled as she traced the image with her fingers. She had never known much about her grandmother's side of the family. "What does this key open?" she asked. "A small cottage at the edge of town," Mr. Thompson said. "Margaret's childhood home. It's been locked for years, waiting for the right person to come along." Emily's heart pounded with excitement and trepidation. "I need to see it." Mr. Thompson smiled, his eyes warm. "Then let's go." The drive to the cottage was quiet, but Emily's mind was anything but. The revelations from Mr. Thompson weighed heavily on her. She had family she never knew about, a history hidden in the very town she had chosen to call home. The countryside unfolded before them, vast green fields stretching to the horizon, dotted with oak trees that stood like silent sentinels of time. The road curved gently, following the lazy bends of a small stream, its waters glistening under the afternoon sun. Mr. Thompson, sitting beside her in the passenger seat, gazed out at the landscape with a nostalgic smile. "It hasn't changed much," he murmured. "Margaret and I used to take this road every summer. She always said the wildflowers along this path were the most beautiful in spring." Emily glanced at the roadside, where bursts of yellow, violet, and white blossoms swayed in the breeze. She imagined a young Margaret walking here, laughter in her voice, barefoot on the warm earth. After a few more miles, the trees grew denser, forming a tunnel of green, and then suddenly the path opened up to a clearing. Nestled at the edge of a thick grove of oak and cypress trees stood a small, weathered cottage. Its stone walls, though worn by time, still stood strong, and the slate roof had patches of moss creeping along the edges. Vines curled around the wooden porch railing, their leaves fluttering like whispers in the wind. A rusted wind chime dangled from a nail, its soft, melodic clinking adding an eerie charm to the quiet surroundings. Emily stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under her boots. A strange mixture of emotions stirred within her. Excitement, curiosity, and an odd sense of familiarity. Mr. Thompson joined her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. This was Margaret's childhood home. No one's lived here for years. Emily swallowed, stepping closer. The windows, though dusty, revealed glimpses of the past. Lace curtains still hung inside, slightly tattered but intact. The wooden door, darkened with age, bore a brass knocker shaped like a bird. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the key Mr. Thompson had given her. It slid into the lock smoothly, as if it, too, had been waiting for her. With a deep breath, she turned the key. The door creaked open, revealing a space frozen in time. The air inside was thick with the scent of aged wood, faded lavender, and something else, something nostalgic and unnameable. Dust particles danced in the golden shafts of light streaming through the windows. A small sitting room lay before her, furnished with well-worn armchairs covered in floral fabric. A wooden rocking chair sat near the fireplace, where a pile of neatly stacked logs still waited to be burned. Emily's gaze traveled across the room, landing on a mantelpiece lined with framed photographs. As she moved closer, she saw them. Images of Margaret as a young girl. A woman with the same warm eyes as Mr. Thompson, standing beside another woman who bore a striking resemblance to Emily's mother. Her breath hitched. "You see now," Mr. Thompson said softly, standing beside her. "You belong to this place, Emily." She reached out, picking up one of the frames. The two young women in the picture stood in front of this very house, arms wrapped around each other, their smiles radiant. "My grandmother," Emily whispered. "She and Margaret were inseparable," Mr. Thompson said, "but life pulled them apart. Your grandmother moved to the city, and though they wrote to each other, time and distance did what they always do." He sighed, his voice carrying the weight of old sorrow. But Margaret never forgot. She always hoped that someday someone from her family would come back. Emily felt her chest tighten. She had spent so much of her life feeling disconnected, wandering from place to place in search of something she couldn't name. And yet, here it was, a history, a home, a legacy waiting for her. She turned to Mr. Thompson. "I want to know everything, every story, every memory." He smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Then let's start from the beginning." As they sat together in the warm glow of the fading sunlight, Mr. Thompson began to speak, weaving tales of the past, of a sisterhood that had endured despite the years, of love, laughter, and dreams etched into the walls of the little cottage. Emily listened, her heart filling with something she hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. The night had settled gently over the cottage, draping the land in a soft, velvety darkness. The moonlight streamed through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the wooden floors. Emily sat at the small dining table, an old leather-bound journal resting in front of her. Mr. Thompson had found it tucked away in a drawer, wrapped in faded linen. "This belonged to Margaret," he had said, placing it in Emily's hands with the utmost care. "She wrote everything in here, her thoughts, her dreams, her longing for the family she lost." Emily hesitated before opening the journal, her fingers tracing the weathered edges of the pages. The scent of aged paper and ink filled her senses as she turned to the first entry. June 15th, 1968. Today, the garden was filled with butterflies. Mama says they carry wishes from one soul to another. I wonder if my sister thinks of me as much as I think of her. Emily's heart clenched. Margaret's words felt so intimate, as though she had reached across time to speak directly to her. She read on, flipping through pages of memories, some happy, others wistful. She read about Margaret's childhood here in the cottage, about the wildflowers she planted in the backyard, about letters that went unanswered. Mr. Thompson sat across from her, his gaze soft. "She wrote every day," he murmured. "Even when the letters from your grandmother stopped coming, she kept writing." Emily swallowed hard. Did my grandmother ever try to come back? Mr. Thompson sighed, rubbing his weathered hands together. "Life got in the way, as it often does. Your grandmother married young, had a family of her own in the city. She always meant to return, but time kept slipping away." Emily closed the journal gently, absorbing the weight of what she had just read. It was strange, the way love could stretch across generations, across distance, and still find its way home. She rose from her chair and walked to the back door. The garden lay beyond, bathed in silver light. The wildflowers Margaret had once planted had grown unruly, spreading across the small yard like a forgotten masterpiece. "She loved this garden," Mr. Thompson said, stepping beside her. "She believed that every flower had a story." Emily knelt, running her fingers through the cool grass. A sense of peace settled over her, as though the earth itself had been waiting for her return. "She was waiting for me," she whispered. Mr. Thompson placed a hand on her shoulder. "Perhaps in some way, she still is." Emily stood, determination flickering in her chest. "I want to stay," she said, turning to Mr. Thompson. "I want to restore this place, bring it back to life." His face broke into a knowing smile. "I had a feeling you might say that." Over the next few weeks, Emily threw herself into the restoration of the cottage. She scrubbed floors, repainted the walls, and carefully polished every piece of furniture left behind. Mr. Thompson was by her side every step of the way, offering stories and laughter as they worked. The neighbors from Maplewood Lane came by often, bringing meals, offering help, sharing their own memories of Margaret and the little cottage. The place that had once stood abandoned now buzzed with life again. One afternoon, as Emily tended to the overgrown garden, she unearthed something beneath the soil, an old tin box, rusted with age. She carefully pried it open, revealing its contents, a bundle of letters tied together with twine. Letters addressed to her grandmother. Letters that had never been sent. With trembling hands, she untied the bundle and read the first one. "My dearest sister, I miss you every day. I know life has taken you far from here, but I hope one day you will return. This place will always be yours, no matter how much time passes." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. She clutched the letters to her chest, overwhelmed by the love that had endured despite the silence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she knew, without a doubt, that she had found what she had been searching for all along. A home, a history, a family's love that had never truly been lost. And as she stood there, in the heart of the garden Margaret had once tended, Emily whispered a quiet promise to the night. I'm home. Story 2. A Love Written in the Star. The soft chime of the bookstore's bell rang as Naomi stepped inside, the warmth of the space wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. The scent of old pages and freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, creating a quiet sanctuary from the bustling streets outside. She adjusted the strap of her canvas tote bag, brushing a few strands of dark curls from her face as she made her way through the maze of towering bookshelves. This was her favorite place in the city. Ashwood Books, a cozy, independent bookstore tucked between a bakery and a flower shop. Its wooden floors creaked softly under her steps, and the golden light filtering through the high windows made everything feel timeless. It was the kind of place where she could get lost for hours, wandering through aisles stacked with poetry collections, history books, and old classics with notes scribbled in the margins. She exhaled, feeling the weight of the week slip off her shoulders. This was her ritual. Every Saturday afternoon, she would carve out time for herself, away from emails, deadlines, and the never-ending demands of work. She found solace in the unspoken stories resting on these shelves, waiting for the right person to pick them up. As she turned into the poetry section, her fingers skimmed along the spines of the books, searching for something that would speak to her. And then, as if fate had been listening, her hand landed on a book with a deep blue cover dusted with golden stars. The Universe Speaks in Stars. The title alone felt like a whisper from the universe. She pulled it from the shelf, flipping through the pages filled with delicate, lyrical verses. Each line felt like a conversation she had once had with herself, the kind of poetry that left an imprint on the soul. She was so absorbed that she barely noticed the shadow that fell across her shoulder. "Excuse me," a voice said, smooth and warm like honey. "But I think that's my book." Startled, Naomi looked up, locking eyes with a stranger who stood just a few inches away. He had deep brown eyes, the kind that held stories of their own, and a quiet amusement playing at the edges of his lips. His curly hair was tousled from the breeze outside, and he wore a dark green sweater that looked impossibly soft. "Your book?" she echoed, arching an eyebrow. He chuckled, tucking his hands into the pockets of his coat. "Well, not exactly, but I was looking for that one." Naomi glanced down at the book in her hands, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Seems like we have similar taste, then." The man tilted his head, studying her for a moment before nodding. "That, or we were both meant to find it today." There was something intriguing about the way he spoke, an ease, a quiet confidence that made her want to continue the conversation. Naomi, who normally kept to herself in places like this, felt an unusual urge to linger. "I haven't bought it yet," she said, holding the book out toward him. "You can have it if you want." He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, please. You should keep it. Maybe I was meant to find it this way." Naomi narrowed her eyes playfully. "Are you always this philosophical about books?" "Only the good ones," he replied, grinning. Then, extending a hand, he added, "I'm Elijah, by the way." She took his hand, surprised by the warmth of his grip. "Naomi." For the next few minutes, they stood there, surrounded by shelves of forgotten words, talking about books. Elijah had a way of speaking that made her feel like they had met before, like they had shared 1,000 conversations in another life. They spoke about their favorite authors, about poetry that made them cry, and novels that had stayed with them long after the last page. And then, too soon, he glanced at his watch and sighed. "I have to run, but I'm glad I met you." Naomi felt an odd disappointment at the thought of the moment ending. She had met interesting people before, but this felt different, like the beginning of a story she wasn't ready to close. Before she could say anything, Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notepad, scribbling something down before tearing off the page. He handed it to her with a slight smile. "If you ever feel like continuing this conversation," he said, "meet me here next Sunday at 3 p.m. Naomi stared at the note in her hand, her heartbeat quickening. When she looked up, he was already stepping toward the door. "Wait," she called impulsively. "What if I don't show up?" Elijah turned, walking backward toward the exit. "Then I suppose I'll know our story wasn't meant to be written." And with that, he disappeared out the door, leaving her standing there, staring at the words on the paper. Some things are worth waiting for. A slow smile spread across her lips. Maybe, just maybe, she would be there next Sunday. The days leading up to Sunday stretched endlessly. Naomi tried to convince herself that she wasn't thinking about Elijah, that their meeting had been nothing more than a fleeting, coincidental moment. But every time she glanced at the note sitting on her bedside table, the neat handwriting staring back at her, she felt something stir deep within her chest. She had always believed in coincidences, in the little ways the universe nudged people toward one another. But was this one of those moments? Or was she just romanticizing an encounter with a stranger who happened to have a charming smile and a shared love for poetry? Her mind wavered, torn between curiosity and doubt. What if he wasn't there? What if she was misinterpreting everything? And then there was the other possibility, the one that sent a quiet thrill through her. What if he was waiting, just like he had written? By the time Sunday arrived, she had nearly talked herself out of going. But at 2:45 p.m., she found herself slipping into her favorite sweater, tying her curls back into a loose bun, and walking toward Ashwood Books, with her heart drumming a little too fast against her ribs. The city had taken on a different rhythm that day. The streets were alive with weekend energy. Couples strolling hand in hand, musicians setting up on street corners, the scent of roasted coffee drifting from nearby cafes. Naomi weaved through the crowd, hands tucked into her pockets, breathing in the crisp autumn air. When she reached the bookstore, she hesitated for just a second before stepping inside. The familiar scent of old paper, wooden shelves, and fresh coffee wrapped around her like a warm embrace. The golden light, filtering through the tall windows, gave the space a dreamlike quality, and a soft jazz played in the background, blending seamlessly with the quiet murmur of customers browsing through books. Her eyes scanned the room, searching, and then she saw him. Elijah sat near the large window, flipping through a book, his fingers absent-mindedly turning the pages. The sunlight framed his silhouette, casting a warm glow over his features. He was dressed casually. Dark jeans, a gray sweater, a brown leather watch peeking from under his sleeve. He looked relaxed, yet there was something in the way he kept glancing toward the door that made Naomi's stomach flip. For a moment, she stood frozen, watching him. He looked familiar in a way that didn't make sense, as if they had known each other long before this moment. Then, as if sensing her presence, he looked up. His lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. "You came," he said simply, closing the book. Naomi exhaled, trying to ignore the nervous energy prickling her skin. "I guess I was curious." He chuckled, placing the book on the table. Curiosity is a good enough reason for anything. She slid into the chair across from him, suddenly feeling self-conscious under his gaze. Up close, she noticed little details she hadn't before. The faint dimple on his left cheek, the way his fingers drummed absently against the wooden tabletop, the small crescent scar near his eyebrow. "So," she said, folding her arms on the table, "is this the part where you tell me this was all some elaborate plan to get me to go on a date with you?" Elijah leaned back, amusement flickering in his eyes. If it was, would it have worked? Naomi pretended to consider. "Depends. Are you as interesting as I remember?" "Guess we'll find out." A waitress arrived at their table, a notepad in hand. "Can I get you two something to drink?" Naomi ordered a chai latte, while Elijah opted for black coffee. As the waitress walked away, Naomi leaned forward slightly. "All right, Elijah. Since we're doing this, tell me something about yourself that I won't find in a book." He smiled, tilting his head as if considering the question. "I take pictures of strangers when they think no one's watching." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "That sounds mildly concerning." He laughed. "It's not as creepy as it sounds. I capture moments, the kind that people don't realize are beautiful until they're frozen in time." She studied him, intrigued. "So, you're a photographer?" "Freelance," he confirmed. "I travel a lot, but I always find my way back to places like this. Places that feel like home even when they aren't." Naomi nodded slowly. "I like that." Their drinks arrived, the warmth of her chai comforting against her palms. They continued talking, about books, about their favorite cities, about the small things that made life feel meaningful. Naomi learned that Elijah loved rainy days, that he had an odd habit of collecting matchboxes from every place he visited, and that he believed coffee tasted best when shared with good company. She told him about her job in publishing, about how she loved words but hated deadlines. She confessed that she often read the last page of a book first, just to know how it ended. Elijah had laughed at that. "So, you don't like surprises?" "It's not that," she admitted. "I just like knowing that everything will turn out okay in the end." There was something in the way he looked at her then, like he was memorizing the moment, tucking it away like one of the photographs he described. Hours passed without them noticing. The bookstore grew quieter, the golden light fading into dusk. "I should probably let you go," Naomi said reluctantly, though she didn't want to leave. Elijah studied her for a moment, then reached into his pocket again. "I have an idea," he said, scribbling something on a slip of paper. Naomi raised a brow as he slid it across the table. "Another note?" "Call it a tradition." She unfolded it. "If you're free next Sunday, meet me at the cafe across the street at 3 p.m. I hear they have the best pie in town." She chuckled, shaking her head. "You like leaving things to fate, don't you?" Elijah's smile was easy, warm. "Some things are worth waiting for." Naomi bit her lip, considering. "Okay," she said. "Next Sunday." And just like that, something new had begun. The week passed in a blur, but Naomi felt every moment. She told herself she wasn't counting the days until Sunday, that she wasn't thinking about Elijah as much as she was. But every time she glanced at the small note tucked into the corner of her mirror, the neat handwriting staring back at her, she felt the undeniable excitement bloom again. Sunday afternoon arrived, and Naomi found herself standing outside Bennett's Cafe, a small charming spot known for its homemade pies and cozy atmosphere. It was one of those places with mismatched chairs, rustic wooden tables, and a chalkboard menu that changed daily. A golden bell jingled above the door as she stepped inside, and the aroma of fresh coffee and baked cinnamon filled the air. She spotted Elijah before he saw her. He sat near the window, flipping through a notebook, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping against his coffee cup. The late afternoon sunlight streamed in, casting a golden glow over his dark curls. He looked comfortable, like he belonged in a place like this, as if he could blend seamlessly into the world but still leave an impression. Naomi hesitated for just a moment before making her way to his table. "You're early," she teased, pulling out a chair across from him. Elijah looked up, grinning. "And you're right on time." "I considered making you wait," she admitted, "but I figured I owed you at least one slice of pie for dragging me into your fate-driven schemes." He laughed, pushing a menu toward her. "In that case, I recommend the blueberry crumble. It's life-changing." She smirked, scanning the list of desserts. "That's a bold claim." "You'll see." The waitress arrived to take their order. Blueberry crumble pie for both of them, along with Naomi's usual chai and Elijah's black coffee. Once she walked away, Naomi leaned back in her chair, studying him. "So, Elijah," she mused, "I've met plenty of people in my life, but none of them have handed me mysterious notes and invited me on a fate-driven adventure. Do you do this often, or am I just special?" He smirked, stirring his coffee. "What if I told you that sometimes the universe aligns in ways we don't understand? And maybe, just maybe, this was one of those moments." She rolled her eyes, but she couldn't help the small smile tugging at her lips. "You really believe that, don't you?" "I do," he admitted. "There are billions of people in the world, Naomi. And somehow, you and I were in the same bookstore, at the same moment, reaching for the same book." She raised an eyebrow. "And what does that mean?" Elijah shrugged, sipping his coffee. "It means we were meant to have this conversation, meant to share a slice of pie, meant to find out what happens next." Naomi studied him, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. She wasn't sure if she believed in fate the way he did, but there was something intoxicating about the way he saw the world. He spoke as if life was one long, beautifully written novel, as if every page held a purpose, every chapter a reason. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, stretching across topics as the cafe buzzed around them. Naomi learned that Elijah had been taking photographs since he was 16, that he had traveled to places she had only dreamed of. He told her about the way light danced in Morocco, how the streets of Tokyo hummed with life, how the quiet serenity of the Scottish Highlands had made him feel like time had stopped. "And yet," he said, resting his chin in his hand, "here I am, back in this city, sitting across from you." She smirked. "I'd like to think that means something, but I also know pie has a gravitational pull that brings people back to this cafe." Elijah laughed, shaking his head. "Maybe so, but I think it's more than that." Their pies arrived, warm and fragrant, the blueberries glistening under a golden layer of crumble. Naomi took a forkful, her eyes widening as the sweet, tart flavors melted on her tongue. "Okay," she admitted, pointing her fork at him. "You were right. This is life-changing." "I wouldn't lie to you," Elijah said, taking a bite of his own. "I take my pie recommendations very seriously." She chuckled, shaking her head. "So, what's next? Another note? Another invitation to test fate?" Elijah leaned forward slightly, his eyes twinkling. "That depends. Do you want to see where this goes?" Naomi hesitated, but only for a second. She did. She wanted to see what happened next. She wanted to keep writing this story. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's see." Elijah grinned. "Then I guess I'll have to make sure our next chapter is worth reading." And somehow, Naomi already knew it would be. The city stretched before them, humming with life as Naomi and Elijah left the cafe, stepping onto streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. The evening had settled in, wrapping the world in a blanket of golden and amber hues. The sidewalks carried the quiet rhythm of the city, couples walking hand in hand, the distant laughter of a group spilling out of a restaurant, the slow hush of cars passing by. Naomi felt the weight of time shifting around her, the present moment expanding, stretching out into something more than an ordinary Sunday night. She hadn't expected to feel this comfortable. The space between them felt easy, as though it had always been there, waiting to be filled. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of roasting chestnuts from a street vendor and the faint perfume of damp pavement after a brief drizzle earlier in the afternoon. Naomi's boots tapped softly against the cobblestone street, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat as she matched Elijah's unhurried pace. A bookstore stood at the corner of the street, its wide display window casting a warm glow onto the sidewalk. The glass reflected the world outside, blending reality with the carefully curated stack of books and small trinkets arranged inside. She glanced at it in passing, drawn to the way the flickering light illuminated the titles. Books had always been her sanctuary, her escape into other lives, other worlds. Elijah walked beside her, his presence steady, unrushed. There was something about the way he carried himself, unbothered by the passage of time, as if he had learned long ago that life wasn't meant to be hurried. He paused near a small park entrance, pushing open the wrought iron gate with an easy motion. The path ahead wound between towering trees, their bare branches stretching toward the sky like silent witnesses to the stories unfolding beneath them. Naomi followed without hesitation, her steps quiet against the damp earth. The world felt different here, distanced from the city's pulse. Leaves clung stubbornly to the trees, remnants of autumn refusing to surrender to the approaching winter. The air smelled of damp soil and pine, a scent that made her think of childhood walks after the rain, of forgotten afternoons spent in the embrace of nature's stillness. A wooden bench sat nestled beneath an old oak tree, its surface worn from years of weather and whispered conversations. A patchwork of initials and symbols had been carved into the wood, messages left behind by nameless visitors, each one a fragment of someone's story. Naomi traced a fingertip over one of the inscriptions, feeling the grooves beneath her skin. There was something profound about the idea of leaving a mark, of inscribing a name into a place so it wouldn't be forgotten. A gust of wind stirred the leaves at her feet, carrying the sound of rustling branches. The sky above was painted in deep shades of indigo, scattered with the faint glow of stars barely visible against the city's lights. She tilted her head back, exhaling slowly. She had spent so much of her life chasing the future, always planning, always searching for the next step. Yet here, in the quiet embrace of the park, she felt the weight of the present settle over her like a gentle hand. There was no urgency, no rush, just the steady rhythm of existence unfolding, moment by moment. They walked further along the path, past lamp-posts casting elongated shadows across the cobblestones. The world felt softer here, as if wrapped in the hush of something sacred. Naomi thought about how rarely people allowed themselves to pause, to truly see the world around them. Her gaze drifted to Elijah. There was a stillness to him, a quiet attentiveness that she rarely saw in others. It wasn't just the way he observed the world, it was the way he existed within it, fully present, as though he knew that life wasn't meant to be rushed. A stone fountain stood at the center of the park, its water reflecting the light from a nearby lantern. Coins rested at the bottom, glinting like tiny wishes preserved in the shallows. Naomi ran a hand through her pocket, fingers brushing against a single coin. She hesitated, then flicked it into the water, watching as it disappeared beneath the rippling surface. She didn't make a wish. She simply let it go. The world continued moving around them, but for once she didn't feel the need to chase it. And in that quiet moment, beneath a sky full of half-hidden stars, Naomi understood something she had never truly grasped before. Life wasn't waiting to be planned. It was waiting to be lived. The days slipped by, folding into one another like pages of a book turning without her permission. Naomi found herself lingering in spaces she never had before, pausing longer at cafe windows, noticing the way the steam curled from a cup of tea, or the way sunlight filtered through the trees on her morning walks. Everything felt more vivid, more present, as though her senses had sharpened overnight. It was an odd feeling, this awareness of time. She had spent years moving through life as if she were on a schedule, marking days with obligations rather than experiences. Yet now, the world around her felt slowed, magnified, as if something inside her had shifted. She knew why. It was Elijah. His presence had become an echo in her thoughts, a lingering warmth that hadn't faded since their last meeting. It wasn't just the way he spoke, or the way he saw the world. It was the way he existed within it, as if he knew that life wasn't meant to be hurried, that every moment held weight if you only paid attention. That Sunday, she arrived at the cafe early. The familiar golden bell jingled as she stepped inside, the scent of cinnamon and roasted coffee wrapping around her. The place was alive with the quiet hum of conversation, the scrape of chairs against the wooden floor, the occasional burst of laughter from the back tables. She slid into a corner booth, tucking her coat beside her. The window beside her was slightly fogged from the contrast of the cold outside and the warmth within. She reached out, tracing small patterns in the condensation with her fingertip. Minutes passed. The anticipation settled in her chest like a slow drumbeat, rhythmic but steady. Then, a shift in the air. She felt it before she saw him. The presence of someone stepping into the space she had unconsciously been holding for him. Elijah moved through the cafe with the ease of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. His dark curls were slightly tousled from the wind, and a scarf was wrapped loosely around his neck. He spotted her almost immediately, his lips curving into the kind of smile that didn't demand attention, but rather invited it. He slid into the seat across from her, shaking the cold from his fingertips before wrapping them around a warm mug. And just like that, they were here again. No words were needed at first. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with understanding, with the quiet exchange of thoughts neither of them needed to say aloud. The kind of silence that existed between two people who had already begun to speak in ways that didn't require words. Naomi took in the details. The faint scruff along his jaw. The tiredness that hinted at sleepless nights. The way his fingers tapped lightly against the rim of his cup, as if there was always a melody playing somewhere in the back of his mind. She wanted to ask where he had been, what had filled his days since they last sat across from one another like this. But the words felt unnecessary. Instead, she let the quiet stretch, let the moment settle like dust in the light. Outside, the city moved on. People hurried past, their breath forming soft clouds in the cold air, their footsteps pressing fleeting marks into the pavement. But here, inside this little cafe, time felt like it had paused. Elijah finally spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. You ever feel like some moments aren't meant to be rushed? Naomi's fingers curled around her own mug, its warmth seeping into her palms. She exhaled slowly. Lately, I think I'm learning that. He nodded, as if he had already known her answer. There was something about the way he saw her. Not just the person sitting in front of him, but all the layers beneath. As though he understood things about her she hadn't even put into words yet. The realization sent a ripple through her. She had spent so long searching for meaning in things that were tangible. Career paths, schedules, goals. She had never considered that meaning could exist in moments like this. In the quiet stir of a spoon against a ceramic. In the way someone's gaze lingered just a little longer than necessary. In the weight of shared silence. She felt it now, in the space between their breaths. Time would move forward, as it always did. The sun would set, and another day would come. But Naomi knew, deep in the marrow of her bones, that something had changed. Not in a grand, earth-shattering way, but in the way the stars shift, barely noticeable unless you know where to look. A quiet, unspoken understanding. And, for once, she wasn't afraid of what came next. She simply let it be. The wind carried the scent of rain, though the sky above was still painted in soft strokes of pale blue and fading gold. The city hummed, as it always did. Cars weaving through the streets, distant conversations threading together in a symphony of daily life. But for Naomi, the world had never felt so quiet. She walked without urgency, her steps measured, as though time had loosened its grip on her. The cafe was behind her now, its warmth lingering in her mind like the final notes of a song, and Elijah's presence still pressed against her thoughts. There had been no dramatic conclusion, no defining moment that cemented what they were becoming. Instead, there had been silence, the kind that wrapped around them like a familiar touch, the kind that didn't demand answers, only understanding. Naomi had spent much of her life believing that love, or something like it, arrived in grand gestures, in fireworks and confessions spoken into the night. But now, she wondered if it existed in quieter things, in the weight of shared glances, in the way footsteps fell in sync without trying, in the warmth of a presence that lingered even after parting ways. She crossed a small bridge that stretched over the river, pausing at its center. Below, the water moved in slow ripples, reflecting the soft shimmer of streetlights beginning to blink on. the surface was restless, always shifting, never still. It reminded her of how she felt inside, constant movement, but no longer in search of something. Just existing, just feeling. A memory surfaced. Elijah's voice, low and thoughtful, asking if she had ever felt like some moments weren't meant to be rushed. She understood now. The things that lasted weren't always the ones that came suddenly, burning bright and fading fast. Some things grew in quiet places, taking shape in ways unnoticed until they were fully formed. She leaned against the railing, exhaling slowly. The city moved on around her, but she remained, caught in the in-between. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to rush forward. She let herself stay. The following weeks wove themselves into a pattern, unplanned yet fitting together, as if they had been meant to all along. She and Elijah found each other in small ways. A note left at the bookstore where they had first met. Simple, yet enough. Come find me. Let's chase the light. She did. They wandered through the city, their paths winding toward places they had never noticed before. A hidden alley where ivy climbed the brick walls, turning the ordinary into something extraordinary. A park where children's laughter echoed between the trees, their joy untamed and boundless. A rooftop where the city stretched out beneath them, infinite and full of possibility. Naomi began to see the world the way Elijah did, not in what it was, but in what it could be. In the way light turned puddles into pools of gold. In the way autumn leaves scattered across sidewalks, a final act of beauty before the season changed. In the way two people could exist within a space and say everything without speaking a word. One evening, they found themselves by the river again. The water moved as it always did, but tonight, Naomi felt its rhythm in her bones. Elijah stood beside her, hands tucked into his pockets, eyes tracing the horizon. There was something unreadable in his expression, a thought he hadn't yet spoken. Naomi didn't ask. She had learned by now that some things didn't need to be pulled into the open before they were ready. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone she had picked up earlier. A habit she had taken on, collecting small things to mark quiet moments. Without a word, she tossed it into the river, watching as the ripples spread outward, slow and deliberate. Elijah turned to her then, a soft smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You know," he murmured, "somewhere out there, someone could be watching those ripples and thinking they started from nothing." Naomi tilted her head, considering his words. "But we know better," she said. His smile deepened, and in that moment, she felt something settle into place. Something unspoken, yet solid. Something that had been growing between them long before she had even realized it was there. A love that wasn't rushed. A love that had been waiting to be noticed. And, finally, she saw it. Story 3. Simple idea to a million smiles. The idea came to Michael on an ordinary afternoon, during an ordinary walk on an ordinary street. It wasn't something profound or revolutionary, at least not at first. It was just a thought, fleeting and fragile, the kind of thing most people would brush away in the rush of their daily lives. But Michael wasn't like most people. He had always been the kind of person who noticed things, the way a stranger's shoulders sagged ever so slightly when they were carrying an invisible burden. The way an old man at the park watched people with a longing that suggested he had stories to tell, but no one left to listen. The way a mother in the grocery store pressed her lips together in exhaustion as she juggled a crying baby and a half full cart of groceries. Michael had always believed that small things mattered, that kindness didn't have to be grand to be meaningful. So when he saw the woman sitting alone on the park bench that afternoon, her gaze distant, her hands twisting nervously in her lap, the thought came to him. What if someone reminded her that she wasn't invisible? It was such a simple idea. He didn't know her story, and maybe he never would. But that didn't mean he couldn't do something, even something small. His hand instinctively reached into his pocket, where he found an old receipt and a half-working pen. He hesitated only briefly before scribbling 3 words across the paper. "You are seen." He wasn't sure why he wrote that. Maybe it was what he wished someone had told him once. Maybe it was what he had always needed to believe. Either way, when he finished, he folded the note, walked past the woman's bench, and let it slip from his fingers onto the seat beside her. He didn't linger to see her reaction. He didn't wait for a thank you or even acknowledgement. It wasn't about that. It was about the act itself. It was about planting a seed, about giving something without expecting anything in return. Michael walked away with a strange sense of lightness, as if he had done something small yet significant. And in a way, he had no idea how much that simple moment would change everything. The next day, he couldn't stop thinking about it. The act had been spontaneous. A passing thought turned into action. But now it lingered in his mind like a melody he couldn't shake. He wondered if she had read the note, if it had mattered, if, for even a second, it had made her feel less alone. The thought was enough to make him want to do it again. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at a blank sheet of paper. The words didn't come right away, but eventually his pen started moving. You are enough. You matter. The world is better because you're in it. One by one, he wrote messages, each one simple but filled with the kind of truth he wished more people believed about themselves. When he was done, he folded them carefully and placed them in his pocket. And the next day, he left them in coffee shop napkin holders, between the pages of library books, tucked into bicycle baskets, pressed beneath windshield wipers. He didn't know who would find them. And that was the beauty of it. Because kindness, he believed, wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about being known or celebrated. It was about giving, freely, quietly, without the need for applause. And so, it began. The habit grew, becoming something more than just an occasional gesture. It became a ritual. Michael carried scraps of paper wherever he went, always ready to leave a note in the places people least expected kindness to find them. At the grocery store, he slipped one between loaves of bread. At the gas station, he tucked one inside a pump's receipt holder. At his local diner, he left one with his tip, carefully wedging it beneath the salt shaker. And still, he never waited to see the results. The beauty of it, he decided, was in the not knowing. Maybe someone had been on the verge of giving up and found a note just in time. Maybe someone had been doubting their worth, only to stumble upon words that told them otherwise. Maybe someone had needed to believe in good things again. The possibility was enough. And that was how it all started. How an ordinary man, on an ordinary day, with an ordinary idea, unknowingly set something extraordinary into motion. Because kindness, he would soon learn, had a way of rippling outward, far beyond what the eye could see. The first time Michael saw one of his notes in someone else's hands, he froze. It was early morning, the sky still streaked with soft pastels as he passed by the small coffee shop on Elm Street. The air smelled of fresh espresso and warm pastries, and the gentle murmur of early risers filled the quiet air. Through the window, he spotted a woman sitting alone at a corner table, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of a small folded piece of paper. Even from a distance, he recognized it. The slight curve of the handwriting, the way the ink smudged just a little on the edges. It was one of his notes. His heart stuttered. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the words he had written. "You are enough." She didn't smile, not at first. Instead, she simply stared, her expression unreadable. A moment passed, then another, and then something shifted. Her shoulders, which had been drawn tight with tension, relaxed just slightly. She exhaled, long and slow, as though releasing something she had been holding for too long. Then, carefully, she folded the note once more and slipped it into her pocket. Michael didn't move. He wasn't sure what he had expected. Some grand reaction, some confirmation that what he was doing mattered. But this moment was quieter, subtler, and yet something deep inside him told him that it had meant something. He turned away before she could notice him watching, and he kept going. The more notes he left, the more he saw evidence of them spreading. One afternoon, he walked past a park bench and noticed a piece of folded paper resting on the seat. His pulse quickened as he realized it was one of his notes, but it wasn't where he had left it. Someone else had placed it there. And when he looked closer, he saw something else. On the back of the paper, a new message had been added in different handwriting. "I really needed this today. Thank you." His breath caught. Someone hadn't just found his message, they had responded to it. They had taken the kindness and passed it forward. Michael stood there for a long time, watching as the world moved around him. Birds fluttered in the trees above. A child laughed in the distance. Cars passed on the street beyond. And right there, on a simple park bench, a ripple had begun. He reached into his pocket, pulling out another note, and placed it beside the first. "You are never alone." And then he walked away, leaving the moment to unfold as it was meant to. It didn't take long before he started seeing his notes in unexpected places. Pinned to community bulletin boards, tucked inside borrowed library books, taped to cafe registers with tiny hearts drawn beside them. But the moment he knew, without a doubt, that something bigger was happening was the day he saw a stranger writing their own note. He had stopped at a small bookstore, wandering through the quiet aisles, when he noticed a young man at the reading table near the back. He was hunched over a slip of paper, a pen in his hand, his brow furrowed in quiet concentration. Michael didn't mean to stare, but something about the scene felt familiar. Then he saw it. The young man was copying the exact format of Michael's notes. The same small, folded piece of paper. The same few words written in careful script. Michael's heart pounded. He watched as the young man placed the note inside the pages of a book before closing it and setting it back on the shelf. Then, with a quiet smile, he stood and walked away. Michael waited until he was gone before stepping forward. He reached for the book, flipping it open to find the note. "You are stronger than you think." It wasn't his handwriting. It wasn't his words. But it was his idea. His simple, ordinary idea. And now it was spreading. The change was slow at first, small ripples spreading outward, unnoticed by most but unmistakable to those who were paying attention. What had started as a quiet, solitary act of kindness was no longer just Michael's secret. His notes were traveling, moving beyond his hands, beyond the places he left them, beyond even the people who first discovered them. At first, he only noticed them in places he frequented. A note left at the bakery counter, tucked beside a glass jar of sugar packets. Another wedged between the menus at his favorite cafe. Each time he spotted one, his chest tightened with a strange mix of surprise and something deeper. Pride, maybe, or something even greater than that. It was no longer just him. Someone else had picked up the thread. And then it wasn't just someone. It was many. One afternoon, as he sat on a park bench sipping his coffee, he noticed a woman sitting across from him, scribbling something on a small slip of paper. He might not have thought much of it, except she folded it in the exact same way he did, neatly, with careful creases, as though tucking something precious inside. She looked around briefly before sliding the note between the slats of the bench, a soft smile on her lips. Then she stood, brushing invisible dust from her coat, and walked away. Michael waited, his heart pounding with curiosity. When he reached for the note, his breath caught. "You are loved." His fingers traced the edges, the ink still fresh. The message unfamiliar, yet deeply familiar all at once. It was happening. The kindness was multiplying. Had she found one of his notes before? Had she been inspired to do the same? He would never know. And that was the beauty of it. He sat back, watching as the sun cast golden streaks across the park. The world kept moving. People passed. Birds scattered. Life continued. But something had shifted. Something unseen yet undeniably present. A whisper of kindness carried from one hand to another. A few weeks later, it became impossible to ignore. Michael walked into his favorite cafe, the same place where he had once left a note wedged beneath the sugar dispenser. As he approached the counter, he noticed something taped to the register, a small folded slip of paper. The barista, a woman with kind eyes and an easy smile, noticed him staring. "Oh, that?" she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "Someone left it here a few days ago. I thought it was sweet, so I kept it up." Michael stepped closer. "Your presence in this world matters." His chest tightened. He wanted to ask who had left it, but deep down he already knew the answer. It could have been anyone, and that was the beauty of it. The notes had taken on a life of their own. That day, as he sipped his coffee, he listened more closely to the conversations around him. At the next table, two women sat across from each other, their voices low and filled with the warmth of familiarity. One of them pulled a note from her pocket, smoothing it out with careful fingers. "I found this at the bookstore the other day," she murmured, reading aloud. "You are enough, just as you are." Her friend smiled softly. "That's beautiful." The woman nodded, tucking the note back into her bag. "I think I'll keep it." Michael swallowed the lump in his throat. The words were moving, spreading, landing in the hands of people who needed them. And they weren't just being read. They were being kept, treasured, remembered. One evening, as he sat at home flipping through the local news, something caught his eye. A segment titled "The Notes of Kindness Project" appeared on the screen. A young woman was being interviewed in front of a bookstore. His bookstore. "This all started when I found a note in a library book," she said, smiling at the camera. "It was just a simple message, but it made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. So, I decided to pass it forward. And then I noticed others were doing the same. It's become, well, a movement, I guess." Michael sat frozen, his breath held in his chest. The camera panned to show slips of paper pinned to bulletin boards, scattered on park benches, tucked into bookshelves. People from all over town were finding them, writing their own, leaving them behind for others to discover. The segment continued, showing a small coffee shop where a board had been set up specifically for these notes. Customers had pinned dozens of messages there, their words forming a tapestry of encouragement. "You are stronger than you think. Some days are harder than others, but you are never alone. Keep going. The world needs your light." Michael's hand trembled as he reached for the remote, turning the volume higher. The reporter smiled at the camera. "It seems that small acts of kindness really do make a difference. What started as anonymous notes has now turned into a town-wide movement, proving that sometimes the simplest words can change someone's entire day." Michael sat back, staring at the screen. A movement. His small, quiet idea had become something much bigger than he had ever imagined. He let out a slow breath, a smile creeping onto his face. And for the first time, he truly understood the depth of what he had started. Kindness was never meant to stay in one place. It was meant to travel. The next morning, Michael woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. He pulled out his notebook, the one filled with messages he had written for strangers but had never read himself. For a long moment, he stared at the pages. Then, carefully, he tore out a piece of paper, wrote a single sentence, and folded it just as he always did. He stepped outside, breathing in the fresh morning air, and walked toward the park. The world was already awake. Birds chirping, joggers passing by, a woman pushing a stroller along the sidewalk. Michael reached the bench where it had all started. He ran his fingers over the wood, remembering the very first note he had ever left. Then, with a quiet smile, he placed a new note in its place. He didn't wait to see who would find it. He simply turned and walked away, knowing now, without a doubt, that it would find the person who needed it most. Because kindness had a way of doing that. And once it started, it never truly stopped. The morning was crisp, the kind that hinted at the first touch of winter creeping into autumn's last days. Michael stood on his apartment balcony, coffee in hand, watching as the city slowly came to life below. The past few weeks had felt like a dream, watching his small act of kindness bloom into something far beyond his control, beyond even his imagination. Everywhere he went, he saw evidence of it. The notes had become more than just words scribbled on scraps of paper. They had become a quiet force, something untraceable yet undeniably real. He no longer knew which ones were his, and which belonged to the strangers who had taken up the same mission. At the cafe, he spotted a note taped to the sugar dispenser. A little kindness can change everything. At the library, tucked between the pages of a borrowed novel, "You are loved more than you know." And on a rainy evening, when he ducked into a bus stop to escape the sudden downpour, he found a note left on the bench, damp but still legible. "Even the smallest light can brighten the darkest night." That one made his throat tighten, because somehow the kindness he had sent into the world was coming back to him. That afternoon, Michael decided to return to the bookstore where it had all started. It had been weeks since he had last wandered through the familiar aisles, and now, with so much change surrounding him, he felt drawn back to where his simple idea had first taken shape. The bell above the door chimed softly as he stepped inside. The air smelled of worn paper and cinnamon from the tiny cafe tucked in the corner. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating dust motes that floated lazily in the still air. He moved through the aisles, fingers grazing the spines of books, feeling a quiet sense of nostalgia. And then, as if guided by something unseen, he stopped near the poetry section, the very place where he had once left his first handwritten note for a stranger. His breath caught. A young woman stood there, holding a piece of folded paper. Michael watched as she opened it slowly, reading whatever message had been left for her. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes lingering on the words. Then, carefully, she tucked the note into her coat pocket. He should have walked away. This wasn't about him. It had never been about him. But something in the moment felt too sacred, too rare, and before he could think better of it, he found himself stepping forward. "Excuse me," he said softly. The woman turned, startled. She had warm brown eyes and a soft, thoughtful expression. Michael hesitated, feeling foolish for interrupting, but the words had already escaped. Did you find that note here?" The woman studied him for a moment before nodding. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but kind. "It was tucked into one of the books. I think someone must have left it there." Michael nodded, his pulse thrumming. "Do you mind if I ask what it says?" A small smile played at the corners of her lips as she pulled the note from her pocket and unfolded it. It says, "You are stronger than the doubts in your mind." She looked up at him. "It's strange. I really needed to hear that today." Michael swallowed, emotions pressing against his chest. He had no idea who had written that note, and that was what made it so incredible. This wasn't his work alone anymore. Kindness had taken on a life of its own. Later that evening, as Michael walked home, he felt the weight of something profound settling in his chest. He thought about how he had started this, how his hands had been the first to fold those notes, to leave them behind in places where he hoped, just hoped, they might find the right people. But now, the notes were being written by hands he had never touched, carried by strangers he had never met. His small idea had rippled out into the world in ways he could never have predicted. And the most beautiful part? It no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the world. And somehow, that was the most comforting thought of all. The next morning, as Michael stepped outside, something caught his eye. A note. It was taped to the railing of his apartment building, fluttering slightly in the breeze. His heart pounded as he reached for it, unfolding the paper with careful fingers. "You have made more of a difference than you will ever know." Michael stood there, the world blurring around him. Someone had left this for him. Him. For so long, he had been the one writing the words, the one sending kindness into the world without expecting anything in return. And now, kindness had found him. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Then, with a quiet smile, he slipped the note into his pocket and walked forward, ready to see where the kindness would go next. Because this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The morning air carried a quiet kind of magic, the kind that made the world feel softer, lighter, full of promise. The city moved at its usual pace, shopkeepers sweeping the sidewalks in front of their stores, baristas handing steaming cups to customers wrapped in thick scarves, and the rhythmic tapping of hurried footsteps against the pavement. But for Michael, everything felt different. He walked through the familiar streets of his neighborhood, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his heart carrying something new, a sense of peace, of fulfillment, of knowing that what he had started had taken root in ways he never could have imagined. The kindness had grown beyond him. He had stopped counting how many notes he had written, stopped trying to track where they ended up. It no longer mattered. He saw them in places he had never touched, left by hands he had never met. They were appearing in shop windows, on cafe tables, in library books, and between the cracks of park benches. Some were written in cursive, others in bold block letters. Some were decorated with doodles, little hearts and stars, while others were simple, plain words, written with the rawness of truth. At the florist's shop, a small piece of paper was taped to the register. You bring beauty into the world. At the train station, a note was tucked onto the seat of a bench. Whatever you're facing, you are not alone. Even at the corner grocery store, wedged between cartons of milk, was a folded slip of paper with careful, deliberate handwriting. You are more than enough. Michael paused, picking up the note, running his fingers over its edges. Someone else had left this behind, carrying forward the very thing he had begun. A quiet laugh escaped him, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. He had started this as a whisper, an idea scribbled onto a scrap of paper, never expecting it to echo back to him. But now, it had become something bigger than he had ever imagined. A movement, a language of kindness. A reminder that sometimes the smallest actions, just a handful of words left behind for a stranger, could change the way the world felt, one heart at a time. That afternoon, he sat on the steps of the town square, watching as people passed by. Some hurried, lost in their own thoughts. Others moved slower, carrying conversations, laughter, the everyday rhythm of life. And then he saw her. A little girl, no older than 10, skipping ahead of her mother, her curly hair bouncing with each step. She paused near the community bulletin board, a place usually filled with event flyers and lost pet posters. But today, it was different. The board was covered in notes. Some handwritten, some printed in colorful ink, some large, others small, but all carrying the same message. Words of encouragement, reminders of hope, gestures of love left behind by people who had once needed them too. The little girl reached up on her tiptoes, plucking one of the notes from the board. She held it carefully, her lips moving as she read the words written there. Michael watched as she turned to her mother, holding up the note like a treasure. "Mom, look," she said, beaming. "It says, 'You are somebody's reason to smile.'" Her mother smiled, brushing a hand over her daughter's hair. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." The little girl studied the note for another moment, then, with great care, tucked it into her pocket as if it were the most precious thing she had ever been given. Michael felt something tighten in his chest. This was why. This was why he had started leaving the notes in the first place. Not to be known, not to be thanked, but because of moments like this. Moments where a simple message could become something more. Something that lingered. Something that stayed with someone long after they had found it. Because kindness had a way of rippling outward, touching lives in ways no one could predict. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting golden light over the rooftops as Michael made his way home. When he reached his apartment building, something caught his eye. A note. It was taped to the railing of the entrance, fluttering slightly in the breeze. His heart pounded as he reached for it, unfolding the paper with careful fingers. You have made more of a difference than you will ever know. Michael stood there, the world blurring around him. Someone had left this for him. Him. For so long, he had been the one writing the words, the one sending kindness into the world without expecting anything in return. And now, kindness had found him. The weight of the moment settled over him, sinking deep into his bones. He had never expected anything to come back. He had never thought about whether the words he sent out would return to him. And yet, here it was. Proof that kindness never truly disappeared. It found its way back. Michael let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Then, with a quiet smile, he slipped the note into his pocket, feeling the paper's warmth against his fingertips. He knew what he had to do. Tomorrow, he would write another note. Tomorrow, he would leave another message for someone who needed it. Tomorrow, the movement would continue. Because this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. And somewhere, someone would find a note, folded, waiting, carrying a message just for them. And maybe, just maybe, it would be the very thing they needed. Story 4. The Unexpected Inheritance. The morning the letter arrived, Eleanor Hart was running late. She had woken up to the shrill sound of her alarm, groaning as she blindly reached out to silence it. The world outside her window was just beginning to stir. Cars honking in the distance, birds chirping in the crisp morning air. The usual rush of city life pressed in from beyond her small apartment, but Eleanor barely had time to notice. With barely a sip of her now lukewarm coffee, she was already moving, yanking on her coat and wrestling with her tangled scarf. She had exactly 15 minutes to catch the subway, and judging by the way time always seemed to work against her in the mornings, she was already doomed. But just as she reached for the doorknob, something made her pause. There, lying on the worn welcome mat outside her apartment door, was an envelope. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, just another piece of mail. But something about it made her hesitate. It wasn't like the usual stack of bills and advertisements she collected from her mailbox downstairs. It was thicker, heavier. The paper had a texture to it, almost like parchment, and it was sealed with an old-fashioned wax crest that gleamed slightly in the morning light. No postage stamp. No return address. Just her name, written in elegant, looping cursive. Miss Eleanor Hart. She frowned, bending down to pick it up. The envelope felt expensive, like something from another time. The paper had a faint scent of ink and something else. Something old, like pages from a forgotten book. A chill ran down her spine, though she couldn't explain why. Who would send her something like this? Her fingers hesitated over the seal. She had a subway to catch. She was already late. But there was something almost magnetic about the letter, as if it had been waiting for her. Slowly, she slid a nail under the wax seal and peeled it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, thick and crisp. The ink, though slightly faded, was still clear and precise. She began to read. Dear Miss Eleanor Hart, I regret that we have never had the chance to meet, but as fate would have it, you are the sole beneficiary of my estate. Please come to Hawthorne Manor at your earliest convenience. There is much to discuss. Sincerely, William Hawthorne. Eleanor read the words once, then twice. Her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and confusion. William Hawthorne. The name tugged at something distant in her memory, something just out of reach. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't recall ever hearing it before. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the letter. An inheritance. From a man she had never met. That made no sense. She had no wealthy relatives, no secret family history. As far as she knew, her lineage was as unremarkable as her life. Her parents had passed away years ago, leaving her with nothing but old photographs and scattered memories. Her childhood had been modest, shaped by thrift store clothes and library books. There had never been whispers of hidden fortunes, never any mention of a distant benefactor. And yet, here it was. A letter, a name, a promise of something she had never imagined. She exhaled sharply, as if the weight of the unknown had suddenly settled onto her shoulders. This had to be some kind of mistake. Her first instinct was to ignore it, toss it in the trash, go about her day as if she had never received it. But she couldn't. Not when the words kept echoing in her mind. Hawthorne Manor. She had heard that name before, hadn't she? Somewhere. She grabbed her phone and typed the words into a search engine. The results were immediate. Hawthorne Manor was real. A sprawling estate tucked away in the countryside, nestled between rolling hills and thick forests. The photos showed a grand, towering house, almost like something from a different century, with ivy-covered walls and tall, arched windows. Eleanor swallowed hard. It looked like something out of a novel, and it belonged to her. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the search results. There wasn't much information about William Hawthorne himself, but one thing was clear. He had been a man of wealth, a man of secrets. She took a shaky breath, her mind racing. This was ridiculous. She didn't believe in fairy tales. She had spent her entire life working hard for everything she had, and now she was supposed to accept that a stranger had left her a fortune? She should walk away. She should forget about it. But instead, she found herself pulling up a map, searching for the quickest route to Hawthorne Manor. Her morning plans were forgotten. She had a new destination, and whether this was a mistake or fate, she was going to find out the truth. Hawthorne Manor awaited. The train ride to Hawthorne Manor stretched across miles of rolling countryside, weaving through fields of golden wheat and clusters of towering oak trees. Eleanor sat by the window, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her coffee cup as she watched the world blur past. She had spent the last few hours convincing herself that this was a mistake. It had to be. She wasn't the kind of person who received mysterious letters. She wasn't someone with a long-lost fortune waiting for her in a hidden estate. And yet, here she was. The letter sat in her bag, its weight a constant reminder of the impossible reality she was walking into. She had read it so many times that the words were burned into her memory. You are the sole beneficiary of my estate. A stranger's words, a stranger's house, a stranger's secret. Her phone buzzed in her lap, pulling her back to the present. A text from her best friend, Mia. Mia. Tell me you haven't been kidnapped yet? Eleanor sighed, shaking her head. She had told Mia about the letter, half expecting her to talk her out of this ridiculous trip. Instead, Mia had been thrilled, convinced that Eleanor was about to uncover a hidden family legacy. Eleanor, not yet, but if you don't hear from me in 24 hours, assume I've been lured into a haunted mansion and send help. Mia's reply came instantly. Mia, noted. But let's be real. You're basically the main character of a mystery novel right now. I expect full details later. Eleanor chuckled, but the weight in her chest remained. The train slowed as it approached her stop, the distant silhouette of Hawthorne Manor appearing on the horizon. Even from here, it looked imposing. An old estate with weathered stone walls, its highest tower standing against the darkening sky like a silent guardian. She gathered her bag and stepped off the train, the crisp air hitting her as she stepped onto the deserted platform. There was no bustling station, no sign of other passengers, just a narrow road winding up toward the hills, leading straight to the manor. Waiting at the edge of the platform was a man in a dark suit. Tall and refined, with silver-streaked hair and a sharp gaze, he looked like he had stepped out of another time. As Eleanor approached, he gave a polite nod. "Miss Hart, I presume?" She hesitated before nodding. "That's me." The man gave a small smile, though there was something unreadable in his expression. "My name is Richard. I was Mr. Hawthorne's attorney. It's a pleasure to finally meet you." "Finally?" Eleanor frowned, but said nothing. Richard gestured toward a sleek black car parked nearby. "Shall we? The manor is just a short drive away." She hesitated. Every logical part of her brain told her that this was absurd, that she was getting into a car with a stranger to visit an estate she had never heard of until yesterday. And yet, curiosity outweighed caution. She slid into the passenger seat, her heart pounding as the engine hummed to life. The drive was quiet, the road winding through dense woodlands before opening up to a long, stone-paved driveway. And then, finally, the manor came into full view. Eleanor sucked in a breath. Hawthorne Manor was massive. Its grand stone facade was covered in creeping ivy, its tall windows reflecting the last light of the setting sun. An iron gate stood at the entrance, its design intricate and ancient, as if it had been standing for centuries. The car rolled to a stop in front of the main doors, where two towering oak trees framed the entrance like sentinels. Richard stepped out first, moving with practiced ease. Eleanor followed, her boots crunching against the gravel as she took it all in. This wasn't just an old house, it was a piece of history. Richard gestured toward the doors. "Shall we?" Eleanor swallowed hard and nodded. She was about to step into a world that had been waiting for her. And whatever secrets lay beyond those doors, she was ready to uncover them. The massive oak doors of Hawthorne Manor groaned as they swung open, revealing a dimly lit entrance hall that smelled of polished wood, old books, and something faintly floral. Perhaps remnants of a time when fresh-cut flowers once adorned its grand spaces. Eleanor stepped inside cautiously, the sound of her boots echoing against the black and white marble floor. The sheer scale of the house made her breath hitch. The ceiling stretched high above her, supported by dark wooden beams that had stood the test of time. A grand staircase loomed ahead, its mahogany banister curving elegantly upward, disappearing into the shadows above. Golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their light flickering softly, casting elongated shadows that danced against the walls. She turned, her gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the heavy curtains drawn back to reveal large, towering windows that overlooked the sprawling estate. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in warm hues of amber and deep purple, casting an eerie glow over the vast fields that surrounded the manor. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Despite its beauty, the house felt untouched, preserved, as if it had been waiting for someone to step inside and bring life back into its halls. Richard, the attorney, cleared his throat, snapping her out of her trance. "Would you like a tour?" he asked, his voice calm and professional. Eleanor hesitated, unsure whether she wanted to explore or to sit down and process the absurdity of her situation. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag as she exhaled slowly. "Maybe later," she said. "I'd rather hear why I'm here first." Richard gave a knowing nod. "Understandable. Follow me." He led her through a side door into a study, and Eleanor's breath caught at the sight before her. The room was a masterpiece of history. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that smelled of dust and wisdom. A grand fireplace crackled in the corner, its flames casting a warm glow over the dark wooden shelves. Old maps, framed letters, and faded black-and-white photographs were carefully arranged above the mantel. A Persian rug lay beneath a large oak desk, its colors muted with age but still striking. This was a place where important things had happened, a place where secrets had been kept. Richard moved toward the desk, his polished shoes making no sound against the thick carpet. He gestured toward the large leather chair opposite him, silently inviting her to sit. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before lowering herself into the chair. "This," Richard said, placing a thick folder in front of her, "contains everything you need to know about your inheritance." Eleanor stared at the folder. Its edges were slightly worn, as if it had been handled many times before finally reaching her hands. She swallowed hard. "Before I open it, who was he?" "Really?" Richard's expression didn't change, but there was something unreadable in his gaze. "William Hawthorne was a man of many complexities," he said carefully. "Brilliant, private, deeply thoughtful. He cared about legacy, not just in wealth, but in the stories that get passed down through generations." Eleanor frowned. "Then why me? I don't even know how I'm connected to him." Richard exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. "That," he admitted, "is the question, isn't it?" She narrowed her eyes. "You don't know either." Richard leaned back slightly, as if weighing his words. "I know pieces," he said, "enough to guide you in the right direction. But ultimately, the answers are inside this house, in the letters he left behind, in the records tucked away in the attic, in the things he wanted you to find." A strange chill crept up Eleanor's spine. He was telling her that the truth, the real truth, was buried in this house, waiting for her to unearth it. And the strangest part, she believed him. Slowly, she reached for the folder, flipping it open. Inside was a stack of legal documents, estate records, and, most intriguing of all, a sealed envelope with her name written across the front in the same elegant handwriting from the first letter. Her pulse quickened. She picked it up, feeling the weight of it between her fingers. Then, carefully, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. "My dearest Eleanor, If you are reading this, then the time has come. I have waited years for this moment, and though I am no longer here to explain it myself, I trust you will find the answers you seek. You and I are bound by more than just name and paper. There is history in your blood, in the very fabric of who you are. Hawthorne Manor is more than just a house. It is a story, one that has been waiting for its rightful author. I ask only this: stay. Look beyond the walls and the dust. Find what has been left behind. And when you are ready, the truth will reveal itself. With all my faith, William Hawthorne. Eleanor's breath came shallow as she lowered the letter. A lump formed in her throat. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was an invitation, a challenge, a door left open, waiting for her to step through. She could feel it now, the weight of the house pressing around her, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made her certain there were stories here. Stories she was meant to find. Her fingers brushed over the letter one more time before she carefully folded it and placed it back into the envelope. Then she looked up at Richard. "I want to see the rest of the house," she said. Richard's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted slightly, as if he had been waiting for her to say those exact words. "Of course," he said smoothly, rising from his chair. "I'll show you everything." Eleanor stood as well, a strange kind of determination settling inside her. She wasn't leaving. Not until she had uncovered every secret this house had to offer. Because, for the first time in her life, she had the feeling that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. And whatever truth awaited her inside Hawthorne Manor, she was ready to find it. The house seemed to breathe around her. Every creaking floorboard, every whisper of the wind against the tall windows, felt like echoes of lives once lived within these walls. Eleanor followed Richard through the dimly lit corridors of Hawthorne Manor, her footsteps softened by the thick, ornate rugs that stretched along the wooden floors. The chandeliers above cast a warm, golden glow, their flickering light reflecting against the polished surfaces of antique furniture and gold-framed portraits. The faces in the paintings watched her with solemn eyes, frozen in time, their expressions holding secrets she would never know. Richard moved with quiet confidence, his posture upright, his steps measured. He had been here before, many times, most likely. This house was familiar to him, but for Eleanor, every turn revealed something new, something both mesmerizing and unsettling. William spent most of his time in the study, Richard said as they passed a massive grandfather clock that chimed softly. But there are other rooms that may hold more personal pieces of his story. Eleanor glanced around, taking in the intricate carvings along the stair banisters, the stained glass panels that framed the second-floor balcony, casting colorful patterns onto the floor below. "How long has the house been empty?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. "Since his passing," Richard replied. "The staff left shortly after, as per his wishes. Everything has remained as he left it." Eleanor's fingers grazed a wooden side table as they walked. A thin layer of dust coated its surface, though not enough to suggest years of neglect. Someone had been here recently, perhaps Richard himself. They passed a massive sitting room where velvet armchairs sat facing a grand fireplace, the embers long dead. A massive piano stood in one corner, its keys hidden beneath a delicate lace cover. "How well did you know him?" Eleanor asked, watching Richard's expression carefully. He exhaled slowly. As well as anyone could, I suppose. She frowned. That's not much of an answer. Richard stopped walking, his hands clasped in front of him as he turned to face her. William Hawthorne was a man of many layers. He valued privacy above all else. Even those closest to him only knew what he allowed them to. Eleanor studied him. And yet, he left everything to me. A stranger. Richard's gaze didn't waver. Perhaps you're not as much of a stranger as you think. A shiver ran through her. There was something beneath his words, something unsaid. She wanted to press him, to demand answers, but the weight of the house itself seemed to silence her. Instead, she simply nodded and followed him as he pushed open a set of tall wooden doors, revealing a room unlike any she had seen before. The library was breathtaking. It stretched high above her, with rows upon rows of towering bookshelves reaching up toward the domed ceiling. A spiral staircase curled into the upper level, where balconies overlooked the grand space below. The scent of leather-bound books and aged parchment filled the air, mingling with the faint smokiness of a candle left burning on a nearby table. A large fireplace dominated the far wall, flanked by oil paintings and brass sconces. A velvet chaise lounge sat in one corner, accompanied by a small wooden writing desk with a delicate inkwell still resting upon it. This was his sanctuary, Richard said, where he spent most of his days. Eleanor stepped forward, drawn to the massive wooden desk in the center of the room. It was neat, but lived in, the kind of space someone had worked in, thought in, written in. Papers were still stacked neatly to one side, an old fountain pen resting atop them. Her fingers traced the carved edges of the desk before settling on a small, locked drawer. She hesitated. Richard, noticing her pause, nodded toward it. "You should open it." Eleanor shot him a wary glance. "It's locked." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small brass key, setting it gently on the desk beside her. "This house is yours now," he reminded her. "So are its secrets." Her breath caught as she picked up the key, its metal cool against her palm. Slowly, she slid it into the lock and turned. The drawer clicked open. Inside, she found a single object. A small, leather-bound journal. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she lifted it, the worn cover soft beneath her touch. It had been used, cherished, carried often. She hesitated before flipping open the first page. The handwriting was the same as the letters. William Hawthorne. And beneath it, a date, one that sent a shock through her. Her own birthday. Her breath hitched. Why would he mark that date? Her hands tightened around the edges of the journal as she flipped through the pages. The entries were written in careful, flowing script, each one containing details she didn't yet understand. Notes on people she had never heard of. Mentions of places she had never been. Thoughts, musings, questions left unanswered. She turned another page and froze. Her name, Eleanor Hart. Her heart pounded. What was she doing in this man's journal? She scanned the page, her eyes flying over the words. She will come here one day. She must. She is the last piece of the story. Eleanor's skin prickled. The last piece of what? She looked up at Richard, her pulse thrumming wildly. He wrote about me. Richard nodded, unsurprised. I thought he might have. Her throat was dry. You knew? I suspected, he admitted. William spoke of you, but never in detail. He always said the house would find its way to the right person. Eleanor clenched the journal in her hands. None of this made sense. How had this man, this stranger, known about her long before she had ever heard his name? What was she supposed to uncover here? The weight of the house pressed against her again, the air thick with the past. She had come here looking for answers. Now she had even more questions. And somehow she knew. She wasn't leaving until she found the truth. The journal felt heavier in Eleanor's hands than it should have. It wasn't just leather and paper, it was a key. A piece of a puzzle she hadn't even known she was solving. She sat in the grand library of Hawthorne Manor, her fingers resting on the worn pages, her mind racing. The words scrawled in William Hawthorne's handwriting looped across the paper in a way that felt deeply personal, almost intrusive, as if she were peering into thoughts never meant to be seen. Her name was in these pages. He had written about her before she had even stepped foot in this house, and that terrified her. She turned to Richard, her voice quieter than before. "How long have you known about me?" Richard regarded her with the same unreadable expression he had carried since her arrival. "I only knew that William was waiting for someone, that someone was you." Eleanor's fingers curled over the edges of the journal. But how did he even know I existed? Who was he to me? Richard exhaled, his gaze dropping briefly to the flickering fire in the hearth before returning to her. "That, Eleanor, is what you're here to find out." Her pulse quickened. "You mean you don't know?" "I have my theories," he admitted. "But William believed the answers were for you to uncover." Eleanor bit the inside of her cheek. She had expected clarity, not riddles wrapped in old paper and shadows. But there was no turning back now. She flipped to the first page where her name appeared. The ink had faded slightly, but the words remained. "She will come here one day. She must." She is the last piece of the story. Eleanor's breath hitched. She turned the page. The next entry was longer. "I have searched for her for years, though I have never met her. She does not know me, nor do I expect she ever will. But this house, this place, is hers by right. It belongs to her more than it ever belonged to me. The bloodline is hers. I can only hope that when she finds this journal, she will not turn away, that she will look deeper, that she will stay long enough to understand why she is here." Eleanor's stomach twisted. The bloodline is hers. What did that mean? She looked up sharply at Richard. Was he my grandfather? Richard hesitated. No. Eleanor swallowed hard. Then what? Was he some distant relative? Some family I never knew about? Richard sighed, rubbing his temple. William had no children, no siblings, no direct heirs, and yet he insisted that everything belonged to you. Eleanor turned another page, her heart hammering. The next entry was dated 2 decades earlier. She was taken from this place long before she could remember it. If only I had known then what I know now. But I was blind to what was right in front of me. By the time I realized, she was gone. Perhaps it is for the best. Perhaps she will grow without the weight of this house on her shoulders. But I fear that no matter where she goes, she will always be missing a part of herself. One day, she will return. I must make sure she finds her way back. Eleanor's throat tightened. Taken from this place? Was he talking about her? That was impossible. She had never been here before. She had never even heard of this place until days ago. And yet, something in her gut twisted as if she knew, deep down, that there was truth in these words. Richard remained silent, watching her process it all. She took a shaky breath. I don't understand. He studied her carefully. What do you remember about your early childhood? Eleanor hesitated. Her memories were blurry before a certain point. Flashes of color, echoes of laughter, a feeling of warmth she couldn't place. She had been adopted at the age of 3. Her parents had told her that she had come from a different town, that her biological family had been unable to care for her. But they had never given her details, never spoken of who had given her up or why. She had never questioned it, until now. Her grip on the journal tightened. Are you saying that I lived here? Richard gave a slow nod. I believe so. Eleanor's breath came shallow. She flipped through more pages, searching for something, anything that would tell her why. And then, near the back of the journal, she found it. A folded letter. She hesitated, then carefully unfolded the paper. The handwriting was slightly messier than the journal entries, as if written in haste. My dearest Eleanor, you have been searching for answers, and I am sorry that I could not give them to you in person. But know this, I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped hoping you would return. The truth is painful, and I fear that when you learn it, you will question everything. But please know that my intentions were always to protect you. You were meant to grow up here, in this house, among your true family. But fate had other plans. You were taken, placed in another life, one that I could not interfere with. But you have always belonged here. This house remembers you, even if you do not remember it. And now, it is time for you to reclaim what was always yours. With all my love, William Hawthorne. Eleanor's hands shook, taken. That word rang in her ears like an alarm. She hadn't been given away. She had been taken. Her breath hitched as a wave of dizziness crashed over her. Her whole life had been built on the assumption that she had been unwanted, that her biological family had let her go. But if William's words were true, then she hadn't been abandoned. She had been stolen from the place she was meant to call home. Richard's voice was quiet when he spoke. Now you understand. Eleanor clenched the letter in her hands, her mind spinning. There was so much she still didn't know. Who had taken her? Why had she been kept away? And what else had William been unable to tell her? She looked up at Richard, her pulse roaring in her ears. I need to know everything. He nodded. Then it's time to finish what he started. Eleanor inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She had come here expecting to inherit an old house. Instead, she had inherited a mystery, a past stolen from her. And she wasn't leaving until she uncovered every last truth hidden within these walls. Story 5. The Cafe of Second Chances. The town of Willow Creek had always been a quiet place. Nestled between rolling hills and wide open fields, it was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a slow, comforting pace. It was the perfect place for someone like Robert Hayes to disappear into the background. At 65, Robert had spent the past few years in quiet solitude. Retirement had left him without much to do, and most of his days were spent sitting on his front porch, watching the world go by. That was until he stumbled upon a small, inviting cafe that would change everything. The little cafe, the Bluebird, was tucked away on a charming cobblestone street in the heart of town. Robert had walked past it many times before, but had never once stepped inside. That changed one chilly autumn morning when the smell of freshly baked pastries and rich coffee drifted through the air, enticing him like a warm embrace. Curious, he pushed open the door, and the gentle chime of a bell above the entrance welcomed him inside. The cafe had an old-world charm to it. The wooden floors creaked softly beneath his feet, and the scent of cinnamon and vanilla lingered in the air. A handful of people were scattered around the cozy space, some reading books, others engaged in quiet conversation. Behind the counter stood a woman in her early 50s, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners as she greeted him. "Welcome." "First time here?" she asked, her voice warm and inviting. Robert hesitated before nodding. "Yes, I suppose it is. Smelled too good to walk past today." The woman laughed softly. "I'm Evelyn. This place has a way of pulling people in when they need it most. What can I get you?" Robert scanned the chalkboard menu above the counter. "Just a black coffee, please." Evelyn nodded, preparing his order with practiced ease. "You know, we have the best homemade cinnamon rolls in town. First ones on the house if you'd like to try." Something about her offer made Robert feel at ease. "All right, why not?" He took a seat by the window, watching the golden leaves dance in the crisp breeze outside. When Evelyn brought his order, she placed the cinnamon roll in front of him with a knowing smile. This place has a way of bringing people together. Enjoy. Robert took a bite, and the warmth of cinnamon and sugar melted on his tongue. For the first time in a long while, he felt something stir in his chest. Comfort. Days turned into weeks, and Robert found himself returning to the Bluebird more often. It wasn't just the coffee or the pastries that kept him coming back. It was the feeling of belonging. The cafe had an unspoken rule. Everyone was welcome, and everyone had a story. Over time, Robert began to learn those stories. There was Margaret, an 80-year-old retired schoolteacher who spent her mornings at the cafe, reading poetry aloud to whoever would listen. There was Jake, a young man who worked as a mechanic but dreamed of opening his own bakery one day. And then there was Sarah, a single mother who came in after her morning shift at the hospital, always greeted with a cup of tea waiting for her. Each person carried something, a hope, a dream, a memory. And slowly, Robert began to share pieces of his own story too. One rainy afternoon, as the storm raged outside, Evelyn sat down across from Robert with a cup of tea in her hands. "You know, you never talk much about yourself," she said gently, "but I get the feeling you have a story worth telling." Robert stared into his coffee. "Not much to tell," he said, though he knew it wasn't true. "I retired a few years ago. My wife passed shortly after, and, well, here I am." Evelyn nodded, understanding. Loss can make the world feel smaller, but you don't have to go through it alone. Something in her words struck a chord within him. The cafe, with its warm lights and familiar faces, had slowly chipped away at the loneliness he hadn't realized had settled so deeply within him. As the seasons changed, so did Robert. He started helping out at the cafe, wiping down tables, running small errands, and even learning how to make the perfect cup of coffee. He found joy in the small things. laughing with Margaret over poetry, listening to Jake's baking experiments, and offering Sarah a hand with her young son when she needed a break. One day, Margaret introduced Robert to the local library book club. "You should join us," she said with a grin. "You've got stories to share, I can tell." Robert hesitated, but decided to give it a try. The weekly meetings became something he looked forward to, a time where he could discuss books and ideas with people who appreciated the beauty of words as much as he did. But the biggest change came when Evelyn asked him to help organize the annual Bluebird Community Dinner. It was a tradition she had started years ago, inviting anyone in the town who needed a warm meal and good company. "It's about bringing people together," Evelyn said, "and I think you'd be perfect for it." Robert hesitated, but something inside him told him to say yes. And so, for the first time in a long while, he threw himself into something new. He spent weeks planning, reaching out to people in the town, gathering volunteers, and even convincing Jake to bake a special dessert for the occasion. The night of the dinner arrived, and the Bluebird was filled with warmth and laughter. People from all walks of life came together, sharing stories, food, and joy. As Robert looked around the room, he realized something profound. He had found his place again. Evelyn stood beside him, nudging him playfully. "Told you this place has a way of bringing people together." Robert chuckled, a genuine smile stretching across his face. "You were right, and I think I needed this more than I realized." The cafe had given Robert something he hadn't known he was missing, a second chance. Not just at finding purpose, but at finding happiness in the simple moments. As the months passed, Robert became an integral part of the Bluebird. He even started a book club with Margaret, helped Jake with his bakery plans, and found himself looking forward to each new day with a sense of anticipation. And, perhaps the biggest surprise of all, he found a deep friendship, and maybe even something more, with Evelyn. Their shared laughter, quiet conversations, and easy companionship hinted at a future neither of them had expected, but welcomed nonetheless. Life, Robert realized, wasn't about endings. It was about new beginnings, no matter where or when they came. And, for the first time in a long while, he felt truly at home. And so, in the heart of Willow Creek, in a little cafe filled with warmth and stories, Robert Hayes discovered that sometimes the best chapters of life begin when you least expect them.